Hey everyone, thank you for joining me. I'm a guy called Joe, and this is Bootstrapping Tools Let's Build, where we help scrappy bootstrappers just like yourself figure out how to overcome some of the hurdles that they're facing, or if they're just trying to look to become better or more efficient at what they do every day. Now, before we dive into today's topic, make sure to check out our YouTube channel. We got lots of videos up there that talk about all sorts of low code and no code solutions out there, including Retool, Google Apps Scripts, Airtable, Google Sheets, as well as many others. If you don't see what you're looking for up here, feel free to shoot an email over to feedback@bootstrapping.tools. We'll be happy to take a look at that application and possibly make a video just for you. Now, in today's topic, we're going to be going over how you can update Airtable using triggered events in Google Sheets. So the last time we made a video about Airtable and Google Sheets, I'll actually leave a comment to a link in the description to that video. But the last time we did this, what we essentially did was we pulled data from Airtable into Google Sheets. And the reason we did that was because Airtable requires a pro plan in order for you to create some custom apps in Airtable to do some of your automation. So the scenario that we were playing with was that you would want to pull down the email addresses of people, your customers, into a Google Sheet so that you can use Google Apps Scripts to automate some email sends. And now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to set up that email send, kind of just like a pseudo version of that. But the important part is we're going to also label on a date of when that email was sent, and then we're going to throw that data back up into Airtable so that when you're looking at Airtable, you will know when the last time that particular person was last contacted. But let's go ahead and dive into it. First thing we're going to do is we're going to check out our Google Sheet. So over here we have our Google Sheet. We have our attendees list as well as our speakers list, and this is all dynamically updated using the Airtable API. So if we go over to our script editor, and just in case you don't remember how to access that, it's going to be in the tools drop-down option within your Google Sheet. So that's just a script editor. Once you click on that, that's going to open up a separate tab in your window, and that's going to be your project editor. So one quick recap just before we dive into actually updating all the code here. We created several pieces of functions here, one for import attendees and getting attendees. Same thing goes for importing speakers and getting speakers. The thing that's the main function that's powering all the API connections is the request Airtable. And in order to do that, you have to pass through an API key using the bearer authorization. This key is specific to my Airbase, but that's just full of sample data. So if you want to play around with it, maybe it's still up when you check out this video and you want to try it. But essentially, it's not much real data in there anyway. But the point is that you're using this function primarily to actually grab data for each individual table. So in this one, it's calling the speakers and then getting the view for all speakers and then putting that data into a good format that we can use in order to actually import it into our Google spreadsheet using the get range and set values functions. So what we're going to do first is let's clean up the code a little bit, because right now what we have here is a little bit of code that doesn't actually relate to the Airtable API at all times. It's only really just a request Airtable call that makes sense. So let's go ahead and grab our speakers functions. We're going to open up a new script file. We're going to call that speakers. And then we're going to shove our speaker functions in there. And then we're going to do the same thing with our attendees functions. We're just going to cut that. And then we're going to open up a new script. We're going to call that attendees. And we're going to shove our formula, our functions in here. So that's nice and a lot neater. The only thing we have here is just the request Airtable, and we can actually rename this to get Airtable data. So we're going to get Airtable data. And the reason we're doing this is because down below, what we're going to do is we're going to do an update Airtable data function alongside this, so that we have one which is the get request and the other one which will be a patch request. So remember though, since you did rename that function, you have to go back into the other functions that you're calling that. So request Airtable, you need to actually replace that. Thankfully, there is a quick way for us to find and replace everything. And that is over here. So if you do command option find, So what you can do is you can find request Airtable, and we can replace that with get Airtable data, and just click on that little icon to replace all of it. And it'll replace all the instances. So we save this, we go over to our attendees. You might need to do the same thing, but it's really fairly simple. We don't have that many instances of it. So now that that's all nice and clean, we can actually test it out just to make sure we're still able to do what we want. So let's go ahead and run the import attendees. You see, gets the URL, finds the data, and then execute complete it. And then we go over to speakers and do the same thing, import speakers. Run that, request URL, and then now we have all the data that we need. So everything is working as expected. So now what we want to do is we're going to create a pseudo function for sending emails. We're just going to like act as if we are. So let's go back into Sheets, and we have to get attendees emails function over here. So what we'll do now is, let's say, in fact, let's actually take all of this and throw it into the attendees scripts so that we have all the attendees data in one place and we don't need the sheets anymore. So we can actually go ahead and just delete that script. So now we'll have Airtable API, speakers, and attendees. So within the attendees, let's say function send emails. And then in there, we're going to pass through a spreadsheet as a parameter, and then also data as a parameter. This is actually a little bit more abstracted than the attendees. So let's create a new file here, a new script, and we're going to say email handler. And we'll dump this code in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to expect that we should be getting data within here. So within that data set, we're going to loop through it. So we're going to do a for loop where I equals 0. You can do any type of loop you want, but I like the for loop. It's the simplest for me. I++, and then within here, we're going to get the email address from it. So data I, and then if we go back into our spreadsheet, it's the second row, second column, which would mean 0, 1. So the first position within the array. So we do this. So var email equals that. And then what we can do now is let's just go ahead and console log the email. So if we go back to attendees, let's say function send emails to attendees. And this will just be a function on its own. And what we're going to do here is we're going to get the send emails function, and we're going to call that within this function, but also within this function, we're going to call the get attendee sheet data. So var data equals attendee sheet data. And we actually don't need the get attendee email addresses anymore. So let's remove that, because what we're going to do here is within the send emails, it's going to parse through it itself and then display it. So send emails to attendees. Let's run this, and we should expect to see a list of the email addresses within. Oh, right. We need to pass through the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet actually, let's grab this. And we'll just call this SS. That's fine. Okay, try that one more time. All right, so now we can see that within the console log, we're seeing the emails that are passing through. We're gonna get that first email, which actually we don't want because that's the header row. So we go back to our email handler, and then within this for loop, instead of starting at 0, we're gonna start at 1. That way we're ignoring the header column, the header row, and then we're just going down all the rows that have data within it. So now that we have the emails, we can go ahead and just say, if you were to do email sending, actually, there's a library called Gmail app, and let's actually uncomment this so I can show you. Gmail app send email, and then within it, you can specify the recipient. So in this case, it's going to be email. You can do the subjects, say test email, and then the body of it, body of the email. And that's how essentially you would send it. We're not going to do that, so I'm just going to comment this out, leave it there just in case anybody wants to reference it. But once we're done sending the email, what we also want to do is we want to determine the date in which we sent it out. So we're going to create a date here, and then we're going to use something called the utilities library, and within there's a format date option that you can do, and this allows you to pass through the date, time zone, and string, and you can format this into a nice way. So what we want to do is we want to do month, day, and year. So what we'll do here is we're going to set up the new date. And this is just a typical JavaScript function to get today's date. And then the time zone, let's just keep it the GMT, keep it real simple. And then the format of that, we want month, which is going to be capital M/DD. So that's lowercase d's for the date, and then lowercase y 4 times for the full year length. And then close that out. And that's going to be the date. And we can actually call this today's date. So with the spreadsheet, we actually, instead of the spreadsheet, let's get the sheet instead. So we're going to rename this the sheet. And then in our attendees code, we're going to say at spreadsheet, so var sheet equals to get sheet by name, which is attendees. So we can actually replace this whole thing. And we're going to pass through sheets in here. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because within the email handler, what we want to do is we want to also apply the last contact value over to the F column. So what we'll do here now is let's go ahead and say sheet.getRange. And then now the range that's important is the same as the I. So remember, get range, you have 4 parameters. The first one is the starting row, the second one is the starting column. So the column itself is going to start off, if we look here, so this is position 1. In this case, it's not an array, so it's going to start from 1 instead of 0. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we want the 6th row for F. So that's going to be comma 6. And then we're only doing 1 row and 1 column. Now the range itself is going to be I, but then remember, arrays start at the 0 position. So what we want to do is I plus 1. That way we're getting it for each email. We can just go ahead and update that information. So from here, we're going to do set value, and then we're going to do today's date. So when we run this code, what we expect to happen is that in our spreadsheet, it's going to simulate sending an email, and then from rows 2 onto 12, it's going to populate today's date into those fields. So go back here, go back to the attendees, and we're going to run the send emails to attendees function. Run this. It's going to list out all the emails. Execution completed. Go back here. We can see that the dates are filled in. Perfect. Now here's where it's going to get a little bit tricky, because now we have to update Airtable as well as soon as this happens. And the way that it happens in Airtable is that you actually need to update a particular record by using the record ID. And that's that looks just like this up here. And the way that you get that record ID is actually through the APIs. So we're going to have to adjust how we obtain the data from Airtable. So we go over to the list records again. We'll see that within each record, above the fields, there's an ID value that we can pull. So it's not going to be within the fields like we were doing for the name, the email, and everything else. It's going to have to come at the ID level. So going back over to our script, what we'll do now is we're going to go into the get attendees, and then over here where we're saying attendee info.push, what we're going to say now is instead of saying fields.something, we're going to do attendees I.id. All right. And then in front of that, we're going to say Airtable ID as the header column. That way it all matches up as expected. So we're going to save this, and then we're going to run import attendees. And we run this, what we expect to happen is that this is going to get replaced because the value actually isn't up on Airtable right now. Everything's actually going to shift over to the right, and then in column A, we're going to have the Airtable ID. So let's go ahead and run this, import attendees, got the URL, got the data. I also see here that within our array, we have the ID for Airtable. So we go back over here, you can see that column A is filled out. We no longer have dates, and column F is now company instead of the last contacted. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say last contacted in here, which actually what we can do is instead of doing that, let's do it in our import. That way it's nice and clean. So we're going to leave that as blank because we don't actually have a value to fill that in yet, but we're going to say last contacted. All right, so if we run import attendees again, we should see that there's a new column header for last contacted, and this is all blank. All right, now before we move on, we also need to go back into Airtable and then add in a new column, and we have to make sure that it matches the same name, last contacted, and then we're going to give this a date value. Create the field. It's going to be blank for now, but now that we have this, we can actually go in to our code again, and instead of doing blank, we can do fields dot last contacted. Now notice how there's a space in here. We can't have that. So instead of doing the dot and then the value or the column name, you're going to do a square bracket with a single quote in there. So single bracket, close that out, and when we run this, it's going to look for that that column. We hit run, it completes. There shouldn't be any errors. We didn't see anything wrong with it. Everything looks good. And just to show you what this is going to look like, we're just going to do for Pat Everett over here, we're going to say September 1st is the last contacted date. So when we run this again, we should expect to get the value for Pat. Just like that. So Pat Everett is for September 1st as the last contacted. So now this is all working out perfectly. What we need to do is to update it when we send the emails. So going back to our email handler here, within here, we're going to now generate a payload. We're going to create a payload out of this. So we're going to do var payload, and this payload is going to be an object where within that object is going to be fields is something that gets passed through. Actually, we don't need to do the little quotes over there. Fields, and then within each one is where we're going to have to put in the information. So name was something in there. We can actually I'll show you in a real quick everything that we're going to be doing for it. But name is one, email is another, company is another, role is another. I think we also have phone, and then finally last contacted, which because it is has a space, we have to put little quotes against it. So within here, we're actually going to hold the option button, and this is going to allow you to select multiple rows at a time in order to actually edit them all at once. So here what we'll do is we're going to say, because we are within the for loop, so we're going to do data I, and then we're going to just pass through all the values. So this is the second position now, third position, fourth position, fifth position, and then the sixth position, which is also 7. And now remember the email, because everything got shifted over to the right, now that we have the Airtable ID, we also need to shift this. So instead of 1, it's going to be 2. So we save this. Let's actually add some spaces here, make it a little neater. What we want to do is let's do a console log of the payload as well, so we can see what that looks like. Going back to our attendees, we're going to run the send emails to attendees function. See if we get any errors. Looks like we didn't. And the payload is as expected. There is no contacted data just yet because there is no data 6 at the moment. Families who are safe for home, all that looks good. So going back to our email handler, this data, remember we set it to today's date. So it's going to be the same value. So we don't need that to be position 6. We're going to set today's date instead. So we go back to the attendees and we run this function again. We'll see in the payload that the date being sent over is today's date, September 12th. All right, and we also have a little bit of an issue here because now the role is saying the date. We don't want that. So if we go back over to our email handler, we'll notice that our sheet.getRange also needs to get updated. Instead of 6, it needs to be 7. So save that. Go back to our attendees code, import the attendees. That should overwrite. So now the company is back to where it should be. And then when we go back into run the send emails to attendees code, it's going to execute all that. And then going back to our spreadsheet, now it's in column G instead of what it was before. We can see here the format's a little bit off, so let's just go ahead and copy that format over. All right, so now we're going to make a call to Airtable to actually edit the data. So going back into the documentation for Airtable, going to update records, what we need to do is we need to pass through a payload that includes all these fields. And remember, we just created this payload, so we're actually already ahead, a step ahead of what we need to do. What we need to, the only other things that we need to do now is we need to create the endpoint, which we're going to be using the Airtable ID with, and then just copy over that request Airtable function, which we renamed to get Airtable data. We're going to copy that and then create a new function called update Airtable data. So instead of get, we're going to do update. We don't need the view here anymore, so we can just remove that, do a slash, and then we're going to do Airtable ID. And here we're going to say Airtable ID, comma payload, because we're going to need that payload. Just make sure I don't misspell that. So the method that we're going to do is patch, and that's actually just stated within the Airtable documentation. We're doing a patch request. There is a way that you can do a put request, but the put request will actually replace all the fields, even if you don't pass it through. So patch is going to be a little bit safer for you. So here we're going to do the patch, and then within here we're also going to pass through a variable called payload, and then that payload is going to use payload for lack of better terms to actually send it out. So everything else is about the same. We can go ahead and save this, and we're going to take this function, copy this, because we're going to use it in our email handler code. So each time we're going through this function, we're going to pass through Airtable, update Airtable data. So the table name we actually need, this is going to be attendees. And then the Airtable ID is something that we need to grab from the data itself. So if you remember the data, it was in the first position of the array, so it's going to be 0. So we save this and let's run it. Let's see how it goes. Before we run it real quick, one last check. Airtable does not have any values for the last contacted. The spreadsheet does, and we can actually just remove this for now. So now we have no data at all. And then now we're going to run send emails to attendees, and what we expect to happen is it's going to go through all the emails, it's going to simulate a sending, and then it's going to essentially send it out there and then update everything. So we did get an issue. It says 422 truncated server response, that invalid request body. It could not parse the body. So the reason for that, actually I remember, this is shame on me, we actually need to stringify the payload. So we go back over to our Airtable data. We're going to do json.stringify payload. So we save this and we run it again, it should work. So do that, run. Wait to see if we get any errors. Doesn't look like we are. Execution completed. So we go back over to our Airtable. We can see now the last contacted is done. It's today's date. Within our spreadsheet, it also has the last contacted information. And now here, if we run the import attendees code, we run that, we can see that within the payload that we're getting, it is today's date. So one more time, let's go ahead and just update this real quick. Let's say the last time we contacted them was last Friday. Copy that down all the rows. So now it's all 10. We run the import attendees script. That's going to show us that the last time is 10. So we go over to our spreadsheet and we can see that last contact is 10. But let's say today, now Sunday, it's time for us to send them another email. So we go in and then we execute our send email to attendees script. We run that, it does all the changes, it applies everything, makes the API calls up to Airtable. So now our spreadsheet says today, and then also Airtable says today as well. But that's basically it. This is how you're going to essentially pull data down from Airtable, do whatever type of automation work you need to do within Google Apps Scripts, and then update Airtable with that data so that you can keep both your spreadsheet and Airtable in sync no matter what you're doing on your spreadsheet or in Airtable. Another thing that you might want to do also is to create triggers within your scripts here. So on the right hand side, there's an option for triggers that you can select, and what this is going to allow you to do is to constantly pull down the data from Airtable. So you can select the import speakers or the import attendees or get attendees. You can pick whatever function that you want in here, and you can make this time driven. So every single hour you pull back fresh data just in case people are like updating things within Airtable. You can pull that information down. Now, if you need to do a little bit more frequently than an hour, it also allows you to do it by minute. You can do it by every 30 minutes, 15, 5, whatever you need. You can do that here. And that way you're going to be able to keep your spreadsheet updated. And then as you're doing things in the spreadsheet, just make sure that you're triggering the right functions to push the data back up into Airtable so that all the data is available up there as well as down below in your spreadsheet. But that's it for this video. If you did run into any issues, feel free to drop a comment in the section below. We're happy to help, so don't be shy. And of course, if you did like the video, make sure to hit that like button. It's the best way to support this channel and ensure that we can continue making content for you, scrappy bootstrappers, to help you get better at what you do every day. Of course, we have lots of new videos coming out, so make sure to hit that subscribe button and also the bell so you get notified when we release the next video. But I'm a guy called Joe. This is Bootstrapping Tools. Let's build. It's been a pleasure, and we're out.